This is week 3 of Backgrounds to Christianity. And this week we are talking about the earliest churches and the spread of Christianity. So we're going to do something just slightly different, which is we're going to start with our discussion and reflection questions because I want people to be able to be thinking about them as we're going over the information coming up. So I'm just going to read over them and do your best to be thinking about them as you're listening. The 3 questions that I'm interested in hearing answers to this week, and I'm sure as usual in our discussion time, we're going to come up with others. But number 1, are you used to thinking of Christianity as a predominantly European religion? And do you think that this is an accurate characterization? 2, what is recognizable to you about the early practice of the church compared to churches you have attended or visited personally? What is surprising or unusual? And 3, modern day Christians are divided as to the question of whether church history and tradition should inform our practice, or if it would be better to return to primitive Christianity, such as we will discuss today. Which do you find compelling and why? So we're going to start by looking at a timeline of the early history of the church. This timeline is from a couple of different sources cobbled together, but I've done my best to put together something that's going to sort of sum us up about the first 300 years of church history, to just sort of orient us. And I know that I found it surprising in some cases how early things were happening. I wasn't necessarily aware of it. So just kind of be thinking about, does this track with what I assumed to be true or with what I imagined to be true or not? I'm curious to hear from you guys at the end what you think. So starting in about 30 AD, these are all things that we have pretty good historical records for, by the way. Where we don't or where the dates are a little more unclear, I'll try and remember to call that out. So early on, this is in the book of Acts. We see a record, daily worship in the church, prayer, following the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and baptism. These are the earliest known practices in the church. We can date them to 30 AD. That's where it started. As early as 33, we see deacons appointed in the church in Jerusalem. By 37, the church has been established in Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. By 52 AD, tradition tells us that the Apostle Thomas had arrived in India and began planting churches. There are 7, the tradition says he started 7 churches, which then grew into what are today known as the Thomas Christians, who are a denomination of Eastern Orthodoxy that trace their origin back to the arrival of the Apostle Thomas in India. By 55 AD, we have the letter of First Corinthians, which is describing Paul's experience of the informal worship and celebration of the Lord's Supper when he was in Corinth. He's kind of talking about what we're doing here. And when I say informal, what I mean is he's not describing a fixed liturgy. He's just talking about there was prayer, there was this, there was that. But he's not really laying out any sort of rules or liturgy about how it's supposed to practice. But we know from this, we can establish that this was part of the practice of the church, which is what we're looking at, what were Christians doing at this time. Between 43 and 60 AD, tradition tells us that Mark arrives in Alexandria, Egypt, and begins preaching the gospel and starting churches in Egypt. Sometime between 38 and 60 AD, Simon and Andrew travel through Turkey, and eventually tradition tells us that they go as far as Russia and establish a church in modern day Kiev. Around 66, Thaddeus and Bartholomew, according to tradition, arrive in Armenia. The Armenian church claims to be the oldest surviving Christian denomination on earth. They trace their beginning all the way back to this visit of the apostles, Thaddeus and Bartholomew. By 72 AD, we know that there was active Christianity being practiced in Sri Lanka. And we can date to 95 AD, the book of Revelation, where there's a reference to the Lord's Day, which is important because, I mean, there's still controversy over questions of, do Christians worship on Saturday? Should they worship on Sunday? Which day is the earliest? So we can date to at least 95 AD, if not before. And I think you can make an argument for before. The fact that worship was happening on Sunday rather than Saturday. 96 AD, Clement writes his first letter to the Corinthians, describing normative characteristics of church life. This is not part of the canon, but it is widely accepted in terms of its dating. It's being written to the same church as Paul wrote to in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and he's just kind of referencing a lot of their practices so that we can kind of get a view of what this looks like. This is not something we're making up out of whole cloth when we're talking about primitive Christianity. Between 90 and 100 AD, we see Jewish Christians beginning to be excluded from synagogue services. And this is important because up until this time, as we talked about a little bit last week when we were talking about the creeds, there was a little bit of protection from Roman persecution for Christians because they were considered to be a sect of Judaism. And Judaism had some protections from like the requirements of emperor worship that other Roman subjects had to follow. So as the Jewish Christians were being pushed out of synagogues, they began to be identified more and more as a non-Jewish religion, or like an ex-Jewish religion, I guess maybe you could say. And that opened them up all of a sudden to these governmental requirements of loyalty. So we see a lot of persecution. Obviously, persecution had already begun, as we know from the book of Acts, among the, like from Jews against Christians. But now we see it really starting to spread with the Romans as well. Around 100 AD, but some people think it was earlier, the Didache is written. We also talked about this over our last 2 weeks. This is a document that describes basic early church practices. It makes a lot of reference to the biblical books, and it's laying out how should you baptize somebody? How should you pray when you have the Lord's table? What should you do with kind of itinerant ministers? It's just laying out the basics of how to be a church and how to practice Christian life from day to day. At the same time, and you notice all of these things are happening right around 100 AD, rumors begin to spread in the Roman Empire that Christians are practicing incest. And this came from the practice of referring to each other as brother and sister, and cannibalism, which came from a misunderstanding of the Eucharist. And like the accusations that were being made were that, oh, the reason that Christians are having their meetings in secret and the reason they're hiding and all of these things is because they're doing these horrible things. And the Christian answer to that was basically, we're kind of famous for teaching celibacy and, being against fornication and sin in like every form. So why you would think this is true of us, we don't know. But this is where these rumors kind of first start, and they fuel a lot of the early Roman persecution against Christians. We have documentation from Ignatius of Antioch at this time, but the Eucharist was being celebrated regularly, typically weekly at least. So it was a regular part of church life. That's an important thing to know. We know that by this point, churches have begun in the Sudan and in Nubia, which was a kingdom that kind of stretched along the length of the Nile, south from Egypt. So where we have Mark having started in Alexandria, now we've spread out quite a bit around North Africa. By 125, we have the earliest existing sermon that we still have a copy of. It's called To Clement. You can read it. It's interesting. By about 150 to 180, this is the first time we start to see controversy over like weird internal church doctrinal questions. And this one had to do with the question of whether you should celebrate Easter on the historical date or on Sunday. It's called the Quartodeciman controversy. We have by 150, somewhere between 150 and 250 AD, we're not totally sure, we see the development of a document called the Rule of Faith. And this is something that was put down slightly before the Apostles' Creed, but the Apostles' Creed takes a lot from the Rule of Faith. It's a document that's sort of looking at, again, similar to the Didache, how do you live as a Christian? How are churches supposed to do things? You know, you see people starting to write down like, well, we've had to answer all of these questions. This is the answers we came up with. These are the practices that we're sort of solidifying. In 155, Justin Martyr writes a book called The Apology, in which he describes a typical Christian worship service, which includes worship through song, the reading of the Old Testament, the reading of the New Testament, which he refers to as the Memoirs of the Apostles, the celebration of the Eucharist, prayer. By 170 AD, we see some of the first evidence of the practice of veneration of martyrs. People are starting to establish like building up a concept that, oh, like somebody who's achieved martyrdom has done something maybe holier than the rest of us. And this is kind of where we see the first seed that eventually grows into the idea of like veneration of saints. By 196, we know that there are churches in Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, as well as the ones in India and Sri Lanka. So we continue to see a northward and eastward expansion of the church, as well as the westward and southern expansion. By 197, Tertullian has written another document describing conduct in Christian assemblies. By 200, we have at least 3 different translations of the Bible and of early Christian liturgy into different African languages, which again just speaks to the widespread of the church in North Africa. At this point, we're going westward, we're into Libya, what is now like Morocco, and the demand for these documents is enough that people have needed to put in the effort to do full biblical translations in order to satisfy the demand for the Bible in the common tongue. By 215, Hippolytus of Rome writes the Apostolic Tradition. This is just another in this line of documents where people are describing the practice of the church. And these are really important for us if what we want to know is, what did it really look like from the very beginning? By 232, this is where we date our earliest surviving archaeological example of a house being converted into a church. It's in modern day Iraq. And we can see kind of a lot of things about Christian practice from that by looking at it. Most churches at this time were in homes, either homes that were bought and then converted for full-time church use, or homes that were just sort of like a house church as we would understand it today, where, you know, 6 days of the week somebody's living there, and on Sunday everybody comes for the meeting in somebody's house. So we know that that was happening at this time. Like, it kind of corroborates the biblical account. By the end of the 3rd century, or rather the beginning of the 3rd century, we know that there are churches across southern France, all of Latin Africa, Britain, Spain, and Germany. Between 200 and 240, we have another one of these books written, the Didascalia of the Apostles, which is heavily based on the Didache, but expands on it and adds kind of newer traditions. By 255, in 255, we have documentation that communion is specifically meant to be wine. It's interesting, it's wine mixed with water is what Cyprian says, and the Eucharist is wine mixed with water alongside bread, and that it's very important that it be wine and not any other kind of beverage. In 260, and I've kind of skipped over during a lot of this time, Christianity in the Roman Empire has been illegal. And there have been rises and falls in the amount of Christian persecution. There have been some times where basically nobody's really pursuing it, especially in the outskirts of the Roman Empire. The closer you get to Rome, the more likely it is that there's going to be big problems for anybody trying to openly declare themselves a Christian. But towards the end of this period, things had gotten really bad for Christians, especially near the center of the Roman Empire. All of their goods have been confiscated. All of their religious documents were confiscated, and many of them were burned. And it really backfired. Public opinion was not positive. People at this point had learned to have some respect for the Christian practices of caring for the poor, among other things. And Emperor Gallienus actually was forced to restore a lot of the confiscated property, which constituted basically admitting that persecution was not the right way to solve this problem and that it had backfired. Rather than stamping Christianity out, it was actually making it grow. In 306, Constantine I becomes the emperor of Rome. And Constantine did not convert at that time formally. He actually didn't officially convert like with baptism until he was on his deathbed a number of years later, but he did become very friendly to Christianity. By 313, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, which makes Christianity, if not legal, well, it's no longer illegal. It's not like established as a state religion yet, but he does declare tolerance for it. I don't know why it says throughout the Roman emperor. That should say empire. And Constantine is also the one by 325 who calls the First Council of Nicaea, which we talked about in both of our last 2 weeks. This is the Nicene Creed, comes from the Council of Nicaea. They also finally settle the argument about when we're going to celebrate Easter, and they establish some other church norms on liturgy and, as I already mentioned, on creed. Whoops, going to go back there for a second. I believe it's in 320 that Christianity kind of transitions to becoming the state religion of Rome. And this is really important because this is our cutoff date for today. And the reason for that is because once Christianity transitions from being an underground religion to being a sanctioned state religion, almost everything changes almost overnight. Because suddenly, where before Christianity meant risking your livelihood, your citizenship, and your life to be a part of it, now suddenly you could gain political power by becoming a Christian. Christianity was highly in favor. You were expected to practice Christianity if you wanted to be considered a Roman in good standing. And it changes everything about the church. Everything about the practice of Christianity shifts from this point. So we're going to stop our timeline at 325 for today and look at what the church looked like up until the first time it became a state religion. I thought we're going to look at a couple of maps because one of the reasons why things are spreading so quickly is that all of the apostles, and this is for those of you who don't know, were the 12 original disciples of Jesus minus Judas, and replaced by Thaddeus. I want to say it was Thaddeus. I'm just blanking all of a sudden.
Starts with an M, I thought.
Matthias.
Thank you.
Matthias. All of them scatter and they travel all over the world. So this is just the journeys of the Apostle Paul. As you can see, when you're considering this is somebody who is going on sailing ships or like riding horses or camels, you can see like the tracks of the Roman roads where he's taking the overland routes, which made it possible for him to travel quite a bit. And then also his like journeys over the water. So this is one person who's going around and preaching Christianity everywhere that he goes. He's going as far up as Rome, but he's going all across Greece and Asia Minor here, which is modern day Syria, Turkey, Italy, Macedonia, etc. I thought this was an interesting little map. The resolution isn't amazing on it, but we don't know for a fact where all of the different apostles went, but we have a lot of tradition from a lot of different places. And this is kind of where tradition places the reach of the apostles. So we're talking about the first generation here, because almost all of them were dead by 90 AD. The only apostle that we don't know of as having been murdered was John, who was alive between 90 and 95 AD, and we're pretty sure he's the last surviving apostle. So you can see here, just these few people managed to get incredibly far, and then from them you have multiple branches spreading outwards, and that's because of the Silk Road. The Silk Road was a major trading route that went from the eastern coast of China all the way into Turkey. Which is where Paul was living in. I keep wanting to say Nicaea. That's obviously wrong. Well, anyway, doesn't matter. It's Turkey. So from Turkey, where like Paul and other apostles have had to leave after the Roman persecution beginning in 70 AD, the message of Christianity is spreading slowly and gradually across the Silk Road. So we know, for instance, that by the 600s AD, there were a number of Christian churches that were known to the Mongols. We don't have any existing proof anymore of churches in mainland China before about 1200 AD, but there are a number of oral traditions that suggest that there may have been churches there that were later stamped out. And we all have already talked about the Thomas churches in India, and then southward to India into Sri Lanka. And there's also some oral tradition of very early churches in the first couple hundred years of church history into Indonesia. So there's quite a bit of spread here, thanks to the Silk Road and the way that that kind of spreads out across Asia. And in the other direction, of course, we have the trading routes that are going into Alexandria and throughout Africa.
So Beth, excuse me, were you saying then that the gospel got all the way to China by the 300s? Did I miss something? I may have missed something.
So we can document that the gospel got as far as Sri Lanka and into, I'll go back to the map, into Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, which is there kind of north of India. We're looking there in kind of the Samarkand area. There are some references in the early documents of the Eastern Orthodox Church that refer to the lands of the sun. And that definitely means India, but it's also thought that it may mean China and possibly even Japan. We can't find any documentation of churches in China at that time, but that doesn't mean they weren't there, because we know that even the churches that were started in China later on were destroyed when Islam kind of became prominent in the Mongol Empire. But for instance, there were churches in Mongolia by like, I want to say it was 650 AD. Don't quote me on that. I have to look it up, but it's around that time. And so that's like way up north of the Great Wall of China. So you can kind of infer that if it's spread that far, it's likely that it's also kind of into the south as well. But between Buddhism and Islam, which kind of both became much more prominent after this time in these areas, there was enough Christian persecution that most of those churches were completely destroyed, except for a few like very isolated groups in India.
Okay.
So we've talked about the early spread of the church. In the first couple hundred years, we're going all the way at least into like well past the Levant and into Asia, throughout the north of Africa, down into Ethiopia as well, and Eritrea, and into Southern Europe, Russia, Germany, Spain, Britain, France. What is that? What was that though? What was it that was spreading? What did it look like? Did it look like the thing that we know today? How much so? Like, how recognizable would this be to us? So I just wanted to take a minute and look at the characteristics of the early church. And we're going to start by looking at how the Bible describes it. And then we're going to start by looking at how the early church fathers describe it and the Didache. And then we'll just kind of talk about that. So life in the early church as described by the Bible. And what I've done here is just kind of pull some descriptive Bible verses. This is not exhaustive. I would have liked it to be, but we don't have time and I kind of ran out of time. This is a photo of the Holy Kiss. This was considered to be an extremely important tradition in the history of Christianity that has more or less totally died out in American Christianity, especially evangelicalism. You still see it in some of the more liturgical practices. But the statement in the Bible verse says, greet each other with a holy kiss, was taken very seriously for a very, very long time by the church. So what I've tried to do is pull representative verses and then highlight the verbs. Just to point out, these are the actions that were considered to be part of the practice of Christianity and church life during the first 300 years of church history. So in the beginning of Acts, from the very beginning, we see baptism, which always appears to follow pretty much immediately after public declaration of belief in the Bible. People believe and are baptized within minutes or hours. Apparently, it seems to be the case. Acts 2:42 gives us this kind of 4-part summary of early church life: the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, meaning celebration of the Eucharist, and prayer. All the believers were together, had everything in common. Everybody was selling what they had to sell in order to give to anybody who was in need. They were meeting together daily, breaking bread in their homes. And it's important that we specify that, I think, because we see that they were meeting in the temple. In this verse, they were meeting together in the temple courts, but they're breaking bread in their homes. It's not totally clear from this verse if it's referring to the celebration of the Eucharist or what was called the agape meal or the love feast. Possibly both. It seems unlikely that they would have been observing the Eucharist in the temple court, given how much controversy there was between Christianity and non-Christian Judaism. This is just, again, re-emphasizing the idea that believers were expected to be of one heart and one mind. Nobody was thinking of possessions being something that belongs to yourself individually. Everybody is sharing everything they've got. And there's not expected to be any kind of unmet need within the church. Like nobody in the church is expected to have to be going outside the church to have a need met. This is something that we see as a common thread throughout the first 300 years. We're going to look at some other quotes about that a little later. Moving on, we start to see the appointment of deacons. So there was some controversy because there were a number of widows in the church who were receiving a food distribution that was being paid for out of the sale of land, goods, property. So people were selling what they had, bringing the money to the apostles, and the apostles were distributing it largely for the purchase of food. And there started to be some controversy because people felt that, like, oh, the Jewish widows are getting more than the Gentile widows, and it's not fair. And the apostles were like, this is okay. We need to like find somebody whose job is going to be handling these kinds of problems. And so they appointed 7 deacons whose job it began to be to administer these problems. So we start to see the formation of a church structure at this time. So we have apostles, we have deacons, and they are doing different jobs. Deacons are serving in more of a administrative, hands-on kind of way, whereas the apostles are paying attention to prayer and teaching and evangelism. We also see, and this is a common thread throughout early Christianity, persecution and scattering. And again, this goes back to our timeline when we're looking at how quickly Christianity spread across the world. A big part of that was because no one was really able to become established in any particular region, because as soon as Christianity began to really take hold, somebody would get angry, people would start getting arrested, people would start getting executed, and everybody would run to a new place, and the whole process would start all over again. So persecution is an incredibly important part of early church life. Preaching that Jesus is the Son of God. Again, you don't see early church life without this happening. It is a crucial part of the church experience, of the Christian experience in its sort of original form. And it's important that this is happening in the synagogues. It's happening elsewhere too. It's happening all over the place. The apostles are routinely getting in trouble because they won't, they're being told to shut up about it. And they're like, we can't, we're not going to. But they're not just doing this in church. They are going out and saying this wherever they can. And that's important because it's considered to be part of the obligation of Christian life at this time. Everybody should be doing this. Everybody should be talking about this. And yes, you are going to incur risk, and that's just part of it. That's what you're signing up for. And it's understood from the beginning that that's what you're signing up for. By Acts chapter 11, this has now spread from being a Jewish religion to a mixed Jewish and Gentile religion. And that is accepted by the Jewish church fathers after Peter is called to meet with the centurion and is given a vision from God telling him not to say no. And then the Holy Spirit visits the centurion, and people are like, oh my gosh, this can happen to Gentiles too. This is incredible. This is like the best thing that's ever happened. Everyone was really excited about it. And until that time, a lot of people had not really considered that would even be a possibility. It was a big deal. So now we see so we're adding now over the course of the book of Acts, and we're talking about like the first 20 or 30 years maximum of church history that this is happening. So now we're seeing the introduction of deacons, the introduction of persecution, and the introduction of Gentiles into the body of the church. We see the practice of fasting from the very beginning, praying over others, laying on of hands, and sending out teachers to new places. This is the elders in Jerusalem sending Paul and Barnabas out to Antioch being the hub in Turkey for the Silk Road that I was trying to remember the name of a few slides ago. We also have the First Ecumenical Council. Basically, there's a controversy going on between Jews and Gentiles over the question of whether Gentiles should be required to practice all of Judaism if they become converts to Christianity. So there's a big meeting. The apostles and Paul and Barnabas are sent back to Jerusalem to consider the question, and all the apostles and elders in Jerusalem come together to consider the question. So we see a pattern being established here of apostles and elders meeting to decide a question of doctrine. And the decision that they make, and this is also really important, is that they send a letter out. So we see even in the Bible, right, there's a number of letters that get sent out. This is written communication as a way to distribute church doctrine is being established here as a practice. And then what they're telling them, these are the basic rules for Gentile Christians according to the earliest ecumenical council. Don't eat food polluted by idols, don't commit sexual immorality, don't eat meat from strangled animals, and don't consume blood. And that's it, basically. Those are the only laws that they felt that they were allowed to impose on Gentile Christians. We also see a belief from the very beginning that you can prove from the scriptures. And as we've talked about in our first class, the scriptures here is referring to the Tanakh, the Old Testament. There's a strong belief that you could prove from the Old Testament that Jesus is the Messiah. And from the Jewish perspective, That has to be possible. It has to be possible, or Christianity cannot be a true religion. So this is a really important principle in the context of systematic theology, apologetics. You have to be able to say that the first covenant works with the events of the second covenant, or the whole thing falls apart. And it was expected that people would be able to kind of make these arguments and understand them. We see in some of the letters of Paul, there's starting to be some division. People are splitting along theological lines, and Paul writes over and over again, don't do that. Don't have divisions. You're not supposed to be splitting up into factions ever. Like, there is supposed to be unity among the churches. And it's something that Paul brings up over and over again, and was considered for the first 300 years of Christianity, really until you see a state-sponsored religion. That was the standard. There was no real thought of like multiple denominations within Christianity. People tried splitting off a few times, and the apostles immediately shut it down every time. We also see that there was a real emphasis on righteous behavior, and that in fact, while people were encouraged to spend time with sinners and Gentiles, meaning non-Christians, they were as strongly encouraged to have nothing to do with somebody who was claiming to be a Christian and failing to live up to the behavioral standard that was set for Christians in the Bible and by the church. This is again something that we see of supreme importance for the first 300 years, begins to drop off as soon as Constantine comes on the scene. But for the beginning, there's like and it's in a number of deuterocanonical documents as well, such as the Didache and some of the earlier creeds, that in addition to saying here are the things you should do, it's saying here are the things you should not do, and then anathematizing those who do not follow those instructions.
So what does anathematizing mean?
Yeah, so anathematizing, and we talked about this last week in our creed discussion, but thank you
good. I wasn't
for
there.
reminding me to define it again. Anathematizing basically
I missed it too, Caroline. So
basically means excommunicating. So if something is anathema, it means that it's on the outside. It is not to be accepted. Do not have fellowship with it. And then we also see in Paul, he is describing the practice of the Eucharist. There's the cup. It's the cup of thanksgiving, which is, if you go back to the Passover Seder, there are 4 cups. And the cup of thanksgiving is a specific one of those 4 cups in the Passover Seder. So he is referring back to the idea of the Passover Seder, and then that's the Last Supper was a Passover Seder. So he's saying specifically, referring back to the Last Supper as Jesus instituted it. Now we are still practicing it. We are participating in the blood of Christ. We are actively celebrating the Eucharist, and we are also eating the bread. So Paul is documenting for us in 1 Corinthians, this is 55 AD. So very, very early documentation of the practice of the Lord's table. We're going to look also at some other sources from outside of the Bible. These are from kind of throughout early church history. We know that baptism was being practiced, but there's a lot of controversy about what that means and what that looks like. Who was getting baptized? How are they getting baptized? Were they being sprinkled? Were they being immersed? Was it adults? Was it children? What was going on? There's a really interesting paper, and it's going to be in the bibliography that goes into the Facebook group. But we don't have any proof of any person being born to Christian parents and baptized as an infant until Emperor Julian, who was baptized around 331 AD. Before that time, we have no evidence of it. We do know that infant baptism was practiced in cases where the baby was not going to survive. And the justification that was offered for doing that was basically, it's not going to hurt and it might help. So why not, basically? But otherwise, all of the early church fathers taught that it would be better not to baptize somebody who was not able to understand what they were signing up for, especially because it was viewed as kind of like anything wrong that you do after baptism incurs the possibility of greater risk. So what happened instead was that Christian parents would dedicate their children to the church as a catechumen. And a catechumen is somebody who is going through the process of being trained by the catechism, which we talked about last week. The catechism is a system of oral instruction in a faith. It's often set up as like a series of questions and answers, or kind of lists of statements that you need to memorize. But typically, people would be a catechumen into their 20s or 30s before choosing to receive baptism, although it was allowed as early as 3 or 4 years old. But otherwise, baptism was often deferred for a very long time once we're kind of past the first 100 years of the church. So we're already seeing a bit of a shift in practice here, because in the book of Acts, we see there's a public statement of faith and then immediate baptism. And then as people are starting to have Christian parents, so now we've got a question of like, well, what do I do with my child? Like, how do I kind of bring them into my faith? At what point do I do that? Can I do that for them? And the answer that was developed kind of by the practice of the church was a sort of in-between thing. You can dedicate your child to God, but you should leave baptism up to them for the most part, unless they literally are not going to survive to a point where they could assent verbally to it. Prior to 325, which is the Council of Nicaea and the full establishment of a Roman state religion, there's almost no evidence of any kind of formal church. Most meetings were being held in the open air or in private homes. After this point, you see a kind of standardizing of a basilica-style church. This is based on the churches that Constantine was building. People were just sort of copying those. And we start to see those cropping up in the mid 300s. We have a lot of those archaeologically, but nothing really before about 325 AD in the archaeological record that supports the idea that people were building church buildings to meet in. We do see a lot of evidence of people having church meetings in home, and again, open air meetings in temples or synagogues or outside of those, and in kind of like public squares and marketplaces. And that's partly a function of persecution. People wanted to be able to kind of keep it quiet if they needed to. There were certainly a lot of times and places in the Roman Empire where, even though it was technically illegal, nobody was really going to bother you too much about it. But everybody knew that that could change very quickly. And so nobody was really interested in advertising too heavily, like, oh, there's a church here in this building, if they didn't have to. Every early record that we have of the practice of the church describes a Sunday meeting, which includes no particular fixed order of service. But there are readings from the Bible, including the Old Testament, but also the apostolic letters and the memoirs of the apostles, which we now know as the Gospels, prayer, fasting, baptism, and regular celebration of the Eucharist. Another thing that's really important in the early practice of Christianity has to do with charitable giving and caring for the poor. 80% of the Roman population lived at or below a subsistence level, and any kind of state relief or support if you were starving was only available to Roman citizens. And the majority of the Roman population were not citizens. It was pretty hard to get Roman citizenship, and most Christians were not Roman citizens. Because most Romans weren't Roman citizens. It's why people were so shocked and surprised in the book of Acts when they find out that Paul is a Roman citizen. It totally changes your status in Roman society. People care much less about socioeconomics and much more about Roman citizenship. Like it impacts your ability to own land, it impacts your rights under the law, it impacts everything. So we have a number of people who are very poor, barely making it, and mostly not Roman citizens. But the early church was marked by a belief that the surest sign of true religion is to care for widows, orphans, and the poor. And this was an idea that was totally alien to Roman thought, particularly Roman religious thought. There's actually a letter that was written by a pagan Roman priest complaining about how Christians were making paganism look bad, because not only were they taking care of all of their poor, but they were also taking care of all the pagan poor while the pagan priests were not doing anything. And they were like, this is really a problem that these Christians are kind of showing us up with our own people. Clement of Rome was one of the early church fathers, writing just a few years after Paul, repeatedly references the importance of charitable giving and the idea that to continue this book of Acts practice of everybody in the church holding all of their goods in common is a normal and expected practice. He is talking about this as though everybody knows this is what you do as a Christian. Everybody does it this way. There is no other way to do it. Of course you would do it like that. And I think that's important because we often kind of look at the church in the book of Acts and say, well, that's a special example. You know, this is right after Pentecost. They were super holy. They were doing all of this special stuff, and they had a kind of idealized church life. But that kind of church life continues, again, up until Constantine. Polycarp, who was the bishop of Smyrna, who lived from 69 to 155 AD, taught that this was one of the most important things that Christians could do because it set them apart from the Gentiles, in this case, meaning anybody who's not a Christian. And there is an assumption in the writings of Polycarp that the reason that it's so important is because it is totally revolutionary, different from anything anybody's ever seen before this point. It was a really big deal. Polycarp also references communal living and the sharing of all resources. He talks a lot about the importance of saying that, you know, somebody who's rich needs to make sure that the poor people in the church are having all of their needs met. And those in the church who are poor need to make sure that they're receiving that as something that comes from God rather than being something that comes from, you know, the rich person in the church. It's very important that there does not become kind of a hierarchical divide where like, oh, rich people are taking care of us and therefore they're somehow more important to God, or the other way around. There's a lot of discussion over the first couple hundred years about how important this practice is and how to do it without kind of bringing in any sort of weird rich poor stuff. It was very normal among Christians in a way that it was not among Gentile Romans to see a lot of mixing between the rich and the poor, and they were expected to live together as equals. That also includes free and slaves, of which there were a number in Rome. It was really radical in the context of Roman society. Nobody had ever seen anything like it, and a lot of people found it deeply offensive. Like really, like not even just radical, but upsetting and kind of obscene that would happen. It took the established order of the day and spat right in its face, really, to be living like this. Here's just another example of an early church father. This is even later. This is Irenaeus, who lived from 130 to 202. And he's saying, you know, in the law, this is the Old Testament, tithes are commanded. That's 10%. But for us, Christians, the Lord says to divide everything we have with the poor, and not only with our neighbors, but also with our enemies. And that we should be sharing and giving not only with people who are good, not just the deserving poor, but everybody, people who want to steal from us, people who want to take from us, all of it. There is no qualification here, and it is a crucial part of Christian life. Tertullian, again, he's even later than Irenaeus, He's kind of talking about this practice. Yet again, we Christians look upon ourselves as one body, informed as it were by one soul, and being thus incorporated by love, we can never dispute what we are to bestow upon our own members, and accordingly, among us, all things are in common. So we're 200 years on by the time Tertullian dies, and this is still the accepted normal practice of the church. This is not a special books of Acts thing. Until the time of Constantine, Christian conversion was viewed as something that brought individuals out of the world and into the church, rather than any kind of attempt to make society Christian. Nobody expected that you could make society Christian. Nobody viewed that as a goal. There was the biggest conflict that they were struggling over was how to kind of mix with society enough that they could preach the gospel and the message of Christianity without having to engage with it in a way that they felt would taint them. They really did not view society as something that could be sanctified or made holy in the way that we sometimes hear people talking about as an idea today. That idea would have been totally foreign to the early church. Because of all of these things, Christians began to be well known, especially among the downtrodden. You know, you could kind of, if you needed help, you knew you could go find a Christian if you knew where to get one. And when these persecutions would start to happen, as more and more converts would convert in a place, and persecution began to kick up, the results, as we've already talked about a little bit, was not entirely what the Romans were hoping for, because there would be waves of conversions because people were so shocked and moved by the faithfulness of Christians in the face of violent torture and execution. And we're talking gruesome deaths in many cases here. Nero was known for covering Christians with tar and hanging them up in his garden and lighting them on fire to light his garden while he walked through it at night. Christians were fed to wild animals. They were crucified, many of them. They were beheaded. They were burned alive. It was not pleasant, and it was done as like public entertainment. A lot of people saw this happen, and they began to lose their taste for it the more and more they understood the sort of message of Christianity and the practice of Christianity among the poor and with each other, which I think is why it's so important to understand what kind of lifestyle Christians lived with respect to care and giving. These, like, when you combine those things with the way they were then treated by the government, it actually led to a huge explosive growth of Christianity, because people were like, this is crazy. And also, anybody who's willing to die to live in such a crazy way and die so peacefully in the face of such a terrible death, like, there has got to be something major going on here. Like, it really created in itself a compelling argument for the reality of the faith. Just as kind of a last note, I also want to mention the importance of women and their role in the spread of the faith and the growth of the church. Women at this time served regularly in the roles of deacon, church patron, prophet, hosts of house churches, evangelists, supporters of evangelistic ministries, and Roman authorities kind of viewed Christianity for many years as a religion of women and slaves. That's a quote. You know, and to them, that was like very derogatory. Like, nobody cares about this religion except for women and slaves. But the reason was because it was so freeing and so empowering to women. Like, you see Christianity is largely spread by women in the first sort of era, the first phase of Christianity, when there is no temporal political power to be gained from the practice of it. It's a women's religion, which is not something that we talk about a lot necessarily in our modern context of Christianity. there's a lot of kind of muddying of the waters about those questions. And so I wanted to just kind of put that in there. We're going to talk about the role of women in the church at much greater length in a later class. So this is just kind of a little breadcrumb pointing forward toward that discussion. I want to talk also about the organizational structure of the church, because this is going to be important in later discussions as well when we're talking about the history of schisms and denominations. The early church did not have any kind of centralized power structure or organizational structure. The Didache, which again dates back to like 100 AD, possibly earlier, when it's talking about apostles, they appear to be really just sort of itinerant evangelists. They're not expected to stay in any one place for very long. They're not really expected to tell anybody what to do. They are going around preaching the gospel and starting new churches, and that is their main job. The church fathers refer to the apostles, and in this case, we're talking about the original 12 apostles, as having appointed successors to serve in the role of local overseers. The Greek word here is episkopos. We use the word bishop a lot when we talk about church history. These all are the words that mean overseer, which is usually translated in most modern translations as either overseer or elder. It's not super clear exactly what that role looked like from the very beginning, whether it was exactly the same as the sort of original apostles or a slightly different role. There's a lot of debate among historians and among Christians about exactly what that was, but it was not a bishop in the way that we would think about it today in a sort of like Catholic context or a liturgical, like a liturgical church context, where you're talking about like, oh, there's bishops and archbishops and like people who are in charge of like ruling large areas of spiritual influence. Originally, bishops are they are serving with numerous other ministers, deacons, evangelists, prophets, and then there's people exercising various other spiritual gifts. There was no belief or expectation that the bishop is sort of getting up and doing everything, running everything, making all the decisions. It doesn't happen in the ecumenical councils, doesn't happen in any of the documentation of the early church. A bishop, and there's never just one bishop either for an area, or in the kind of earliest documentation that we have. We also see in the early ecumenical councils that bishops are kind of, there's a local bishop, right? So you have bishops, not a local bishop, you have local bishops. So you have a group of overseers in a location, and that when you're having church councils, ecumenical get-togethers, conferences where people are needing to get together to decide how are we going to handle this problem that's affecting multiple churches, how are we going to decide this question of doctrine, how are we going to deal with this heresy, whatever it's going to be, that when all of these people get together, they're all attending on an equal footing as representatives of their cities or localities. It's not... Later on, it develops into something where, well, the Bishop of Rome, who eventually becomes the Pope, has the final say, and they're the person who has the highest authority, and they get to tell all the other bishops what to do. There was no thought of that in the first couple hundred years of the church, just wasn't there. We don't even see the term Pope being used to refer to the Bishop of Rome until almost 500 AD. And that idea of like a special authority being invested into the Roman bishop, we're going to talk about that at a later date, where it comes from. But at this point, we're really not seeing it. That's not what a bishop is in this context, which is why I like to use the word overseer or elder instead, because bishop has become a word that means something very different from what it originally meant. I want to talk briefly and kind of especially about how the Didache describes early Christian life, just because of how early it is and because it's written essentially as a manual for beating. And I'm just going to I pulled some quotes. And I think for anybody who is used to reading the Bible, these will sound very familiar, not direct quotes, but very similar. And I think they just, again, go to underscore the consistency that the early church had with the book of Acts and the epistles. Bless those who curse you, pray for your enemies, fast for those who persecute you. Flee from every evil thing and every likeness of it. Here's the way we baptize. Having first said all of these things, baptize into the name, and then saying all these things is basically talking about going over a creed. Okay, baptize into the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Before the baptism, let the baptizer fast and the baptized and whatever others can. Don't let anybody participate in the Eucharist unless they've been baptized already into the name of the Lord. Let everyone that comes in the name of the Lord, this is talking about people coming to your home, let everyone that comes in the name of the Lord be received, and afterward you shall prove and know him. So there's a principle here of welcoming anybody who claims to be a Christian. Every Lord's Day, every Sunday, gather yourselves together and break bread and give thanksgiving after having confessed your transgressions, that your sacrifice may be pure. Appoint for yourselves bishops, meaning elders or overseers, and deacons worthy of the Lord. Watch for your life's sake. Let not your lamps be quenched, nor your loins unloosed, but be ready, for you know not the hour in which our Lord comes. So again, just that's a real quick kind of skim over the Didache, but I think it kind of does a good job of summarizing the expectations of behavior in the church. I really do recommend, if you haven't read it yet, I put a link to it in the Facebook group. Obviously, it is not a canonical book. There's a reason why it didn't make it into the Bible. But if you're interested in how the early church thought of itself and kind of, I read a description of it that I thought was really nice, kind of summed it up as being like, if you wanted to know like a Sunday school class in the context of, 100 AD, like the Didache is a good place to look and see kind of what the summary was that was being given of how to live church. So back to our discussion and reflection questions, and I'm going to read this and then I'll stop our recording and we can talk about it. Are you used to thinking of Christianity as a predominantly European religion? How is this viewpoint affected by considering the way that much of early church history was anchored in Africa and the Levant? And I want to point out, all of those church fathers that I quoted were all Africans, all of them, every single one of them. What is recognizable to you about the early practice of the church compared to churches that you have attended or visited personally? What was surprising or unusual? Modern day Christians are divided as to the question of whether church history and tradition should inform our practice, or if it would be better to return to primitive Christianity such as we discussed today. Which do you find compelling and why?